The insults and the jokes and everything else is fine, but how are you going to put forth a policy that's going to more positively impact my life and help me, help my family, and also, by the way, protect the United States of America?
The presidential race continues to excite, from Kamala Harris making the surprise pick of Tim Walz as her running mate to Donald Trump confirming finally that he would take her on in a TV debate in September. To help us unpack what all of this means, I've got an expert panel. I've got Jim Kennedy, media executive and former deputy assistant to President Clinton. Good evening to you, Jim.
Hi, nice to be with you.
And Doug MacKinnon, former official at the White House and the Pentagon under Presidents Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush. Hi, Doug.
How are you doing? Great to be on.
Okay, now we're going to start with the Democrats, because the beginning of the week was very much dominated by who Kamala Harris might pick as her running mate. The moderate governor for Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro, was an early favourite, but in the end, she chose the lesser-known governor of Minnesota, Tim Walz. Now, he gave a confident performance at their joint first appearance in Philadelphia on Tuesday.
Just an observation of mine that I made. I just have to say it. You know it, you feel it. These guys are creepy, and yes, just weird as hell. That's what you see. That's what you see.
We'll get on to the creepy stuff in a minute. But Jim, do you think this was, on reflection, the better choice?
I would have advised Shapiro for multiple reasons. One is it would be kind of a sister soldier moment on its own if she had chosen him, and he could have provided a path to moderation, which is what I think she needs. Instead, she's kind of doubled down on liberalism, and perhaps that's a move to excite the base, and it certainly has done that. I'm not sure that's enough to win, however. I do think she needs to move people in the middle, and the Walz choice so far has not really changed the needle there.
Doug, what do you think of the choice?
Yeah, I think it was one of these things where, Jim makes some good points, but I look at it a little bit differently, in the sense that I think Vice President Harris more caved to the far left wing of her party. I think she was looking at numbers and she was fearful, and she was instructed by her advisors behind the scenes that she may lose Michigan if she picked Josh Shapiro, for a number of different reasons, and also because of charter schools and teachers unions and things like that. But I think, to Jim's point, he was much more moderate. Probably would have been a better choice ultimately for her. But again, I do believe that she just caved into the far left on her party. And that in and of itself is a bit problematic for her, because again, who is ultimately making the decisions for her campaign? Is it her or is it her advisors?
Jim, do you think she caved?
Well, I do think she listened to the counsel of those who worried about the impact on Michigan. And perhaps there was a comfort factor she had with Walz that maybe she lacked with Shapiro. So that's kind of hard to know or predict. Ultimately, I'm not sure the VP choice matters. Dan Quayle was not particularly popular in '88, but it didn't stop George Bush from getting elected that year. So it's kind of much ado about very little.
What do you think, Jim, about the whole creepy, weird thing?
Well, I think there's enough weird to go around on both sides. And so I think, and the people in the middle, frankly, are sort of shaking their heads. Doug and I both come from an era when Republicans and Democrats could work together and get things done. Unfortunately, that's not the world today. And yet there are a few people in the middle who have voted for Trump and for Biden in the past, and those votes are up for grabs this year. And both sides need to appeal to that very few sliver of Americans who may tell the tale.
Doug, I think it's all well and good, really, isn't it, saying that we should be nice and play nice and not call people weird and creepy, and it's not just a Republican thing. However, many people will say, well, actually, it was Donald Trump the first time around who changed the discourse and made it, you could argue, less respectful.
Yeah, and it's one of those things too, and Jim and I have talked about this in the past as well. I mean, name calling and personal insults, I think, should be off the table for both sides. With regard to the weird and creepy side of this, as Jim will tell you, it was probably someone like us, from the Obama campaign or the Harris campaign that wrote those lines, and they test flew those lines for Vice President Harris. It got a good reaction from some of their test audiences, but the fact of the matter is, you can roll those out and you may get a laugh and you may get a little bump in the needle, but ultimately that's not going to address the many issues that are plaguing the American people right now. To Jim's point, especially with independence, you want to figure out a way, how do I appeal to independence? How do I try to turn this around? And again, I think the best way for Trump is just to go back and say, guess what? I do believe you were better off 4 years ago than you are now, and let's have that discussion.
Let's talk a bit more about Donald Trump then and his response in the last week. He attempted to take back some of the limelight by holding a news conference from his Mar-a-Lago estate on Wednesday. He used it as an opportunity to bash his opponents, as well as comparing crowds at his rallies to those held by Dr. Martin Luther King.
If you look at Martin Luther King, when he did his speech, his great speech, and you look at ours, same real estate, same everything, same number of people, if not, we had more. And they said he had 1 million people, but I had 25,000 people. But when you look at the exact same picture, and everything's the same because it was the fountains, the whole thing, all the way back to from Lincoln to Washington, and you look at it, and you look at the picture of his crowd, my crowd, we actually had more people.
Right. Doug, what do you make of that? I mean, does it matter that he's not sure that 25,000 is the same as 1 million or whatever it is? Do these things matter?
Well, ultimately, they don't matter. Again, it's one of those things where I think he was trying to say, look, the media's not giving me a fair shake on some of this stuff. And that's a fair point. But for someone like me, believe it or not, as a conservative, I grew up, basically homeless as a child. I grew up often in black majority projects. And so for me, growing up, Dr. Martin Luther King was one of my heroes. And so, there's a lot of ways you want to compare yourself to Dr. Martin Luther King, but crowd sizes is probably not the best way to do it. Again, let's just get back to the issues. Let's get back to the issues that are really sort of tormenting, by the way, so much of the black and minority community in the United States, and why I think President Trump was making great inroads with those communities. And we'll see if he can keep it going.
Jim, what have you made of Donald Trump's response, really, to all the attention and dynamism surrounding Kamala Harris this week?
Well, one thing he did was do the press conference, which, despite its sometimes meandering nature, nonetheless helped focus somewhat on the issue of immigration and the economy, which he needs to do. And he also put the debates back in square one, which was important. And he also was willing to meet the press for an hour. I think yesterday he met with the press for 60 minutes and she met with the press for 60 seconds. And I don't think she can get away with that too much longer. So I do think the debates are going to be important in the future in helping define, people sort of know who he is, but people aren't quite sure who she is. And the race is on to define her.
Why do you think she's doing that? 60 seconds is clearly not enough.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure why. I know why Biden was kind of held from the press, and we all sort of have learned how that turned out. The reasons for her, I'm not. It's not. It's a bit of a sign of weakness that she isn't out there more. I think she does need to be out there, and the more she does it, I think the better for herself, perhaps, depending on how she does. But the longer she waits, the harder it's going to be.
Doug, we're going to get into Donald Trump versus Kamala Harris in the debate in a minute. But I'm just interested in as to what you think, the people you speak to, the contacts you have, what do they make of how the dynamic, how the narrative has shifted when it was Biden against Trump to it being Harris against Trump? Are they blindsided, worried? Are they kind of recalibrating or not?
Yeah, I don't think anyone was blindsided or worried. And real fast, just to go back to Jim's point about he's not quite sure why she's not talking. I'm entirely sure why she's not talking, and that's because her staff has instructed her not to do that. And she just said, yesterday that maybe I'll give a press conference or do an interview before the end of the month. And I think this is incumbent upon the American media to get more back into the game, to try to do their jobs, to try to ask her questions as well. They can't allow her to go into a bubble and not answer any questions and hope to get elected president. But to go back to your other point, I think, the Trump campaign, I just said, I'm one of the lead columnists for the Hill newspaper here in Washington, D.C., and I probably wrote over 10 times over the last 2 years that I flat out did not believe Joe Biden was going to be the Democratic nominee. And the Trump campaign obviously knew that. But I think no matter what, it's one of these things, too, where it is going to be a honeymoon period. And she's going to get another mini honeymoon, starting on August 19th when they have the Democratic convention in Chicago. And, and it's going to be a love fest by much of the media. And so in my opinion, this campaign really doesn't start until right after Labor Day in the United States.
Doug, just quickly, we're going to take a break in a second. But, obviously you have your previous loyalties, whatever. But you sound deeply unimpressed by Kamala Harris.
It's not that I'm deeply unimpressed with her. I mean, again, you can't take away what she's accomplished in life. And again, like I said, when I was growing up, some of my heroes and my enduring role models to this day were single black women. So it's one of those things I would never take anything away from her. But the bigger point is, why is, if she has so much confidence in herself, so much confidence in her positions, why isn't she taking questions from the media? She will not even take questions from, sort of the left of center media at this point, and that has to give the American voter some pause. That's all.
I wonder if they're doing what the Labour government were doing here in the run-up to the general election. They were holding a Ming vase very, very tightly and hoping not to drop it. Let's now talk about JD Vance, because several polls have indicated that Vance has overwhelmingly underperformed among American voters, making him the least popular non-incumbent Veep candidate since 1980. According to aggregation by 538, his popularity has dipped by 8.8%. since he was announced as Donald Trump's running mate. Now, Jim, Doug has already made the point. I think it was Doug who made the point that it's not the kind of, the vice presidential picks and the vice presidents are not always the most important thing to have in terms of impact. However, what would you put this down to? Or do you think that actually JD Vance was this kind of, in contrast to Donald Trump, he was young, he had an interesting backstory, he'd written a book, etc. Do you think it was just a kind of falling away from perhaps over-concentrating on those factors?
Well, I think Donald Trump was attracted by JD Vance's story, which is a fascinating story. Obviously, Hollywood made a movie about it, so that de facto is interesting. Although perhaps he's been disappointed by the reception since then. There was even some speculation about whether he might be replaced. I think that speculation has gone away, in part because of Tim Walz's own controversies, which have emerged since then. So that's kind of been helpful to JD Vance. And so I suspect now that Donald Trump will stick with Vance going forward. And again, as Doug has noted, come September, the real focus is on the two primary people. But perhaps Vance, I think Rubio might have been a stronger choice than Vance. But nonetheless, what counts is what's at top of the ticket.
What do you think has gone on here, Doug?
I think, well, early on, I think the Democrats did a pretty good job of defining J.D. Vance, but it's one of those things, too, which Jim just alluded to, is when you look into J.D. Vance's background, he has a very impressive background. Again, right now, what people should know in the United Kingdom is the #1 book in the United States of America right now is J.D. Vance's biography, because his memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, because people are curious about that, and it really is. It's a huge bestseller all over again, because this guy did grow up in rural poverty. He did serve in the Marine Corps. He did work his way up into everything. I mean, I think Governor Walz the other day, he made fun of J.D. Vance going to Yale, as opposed to, wait a minute, here's a poor kid that get into Yale Law School. I think that's pretty impressive. So, we'll see how this plays out. As Jim and I were both saying, ultimately this is all going to shift back to Donald Trump and Kamala Harris fairly quickly again, but nothing really is going to materialize until after the Democratic convention. Yeah,
we're going to talk about the TV debate in a minute. I'm just interested, maybe because there was such an explosion of kind of youth and this interesting backstory in JD Vance. Do you think, Doug, that the stuff that was unearthed that then he had to try to explain away, and even his wife had to explain away about childless cat ladies, do you think that's had any negative impact?
I think it has initially some negative impact for sure. And obviously, again, and one of these things too is when you have, some in the media, some in the left of center media acting as a megaphone for the Democratic Party, for the campaign of Kamala Harris, that's going to get some real play. But again, I think as anyone who's paying strict attention to this campaign, especially over the last week or so, J.D. Vance has really gotten his sea legs. He's doing much better. He had a great moment, which you probably saw in the United Kingdom the other day when he tried to confront Kamala Harris on the tarmac in Wisconsin when Air Force Two landed, and she wouldn't talk to him. But then he talked to her press pool and said, wait a minute, aren't you guys sick of her ignoring you day after day after day and not taking any questions from you? And so I think that was a really good turning point for J.D. Vance going forward also.
Let's talk about the debates now. Donald Trump also used his news conference this week to announce that he had agreed to 3 TV debates in the coming months.
The other side has to agree to the terms. They may or may not agree. I don't know if they're going to agree. She hasn't done an interview. She can't do an interview. She's barely competent, and she can't do an interview. But I look forward to the debates because I think we have to set the record straight.
Now, Kamala Harris has also agreed to appear on one of the announced dates, which will be broadcast on ABC on the 10th of September. Jim Kennedy, what do you expect a meeting of these two on a TV, on our TV screens to produce?
Well, first of all, I think it's going to be high ratings for a lot of reasons. Secondly, I'm not sure it's essential for Trump to win them. I think Hillary won the 3 debates in 2016, and ultimately it didn't matter. So I'm not sure it's necessary for him to win. On the other hand, I do think both the risk and reward ratio is higher for Kamala Harris. She has the opportunity to essentially introduce herself to people. Everyone sort of knows who Trump is, but a lot of people don't know who she is. So this will become a real important threshold for her to pass. I'm not sure it's wise for President Trump to keep lowering the bar about how well she'll do, because she could surpass that low bar. But she faces a somewhat higher bar in terms of how she comes across, and that'll be fascinating.
And Jim, what kind of speaker, what kind of debater is she?
You know, I haven't, the most we've seen is back in 2020 when she was initially running, in 2019, frankly, when she started to run for president. There was several of those tiered debates. In fact, she challenged Joe Biden in one of them about busing, and that became a big moment at that time. So she does have a prosecutorial experience, which I'm sure she'll bring to bear in the debate. So she knows how to marshal an argument, and I'm sure she'll try to do that. Although at the same time, she can't simply prosecute. She needs to offer a positive vision, as does Donald Trump. I think that's the mission for both of them.
Doug, do you think, is it fair to say that, and this is not meant in a critical way, it's perhaps meant as a statement of a fact or opinion from some people, that Donald Trump approaches most of these big events, debates, etc., in one way, and that he's not necessarily going to change the way that he approaches these, perhaps because he feels he doesn't have to?
I think that's correct. I think with President Trump, what you see is what you get. He's not going to really change. He's going to try to, as much as possible, stick to the positives in these debates with, Vice President Harris. And I think a lot of it's going to depend on what the questions are from the moderators as well. To Jim's point, when Kamala Harris ran for president in the Democratic primary in 2019 and 2020, she was actually the first person out of the race. I mean, she failed miserably. She had a very good boom, just like she's having right now, and all of a sudden that boom just dropped off dramatically. And so the Trump campaign is certainly hoping for that. So I think, to be honest, I do believe that the Trump campaign and President Trump is really looking forward to the first debate. He said he would do all 3, and Kamala Harris has said, well, wait a minute, I'm only going to do the first one, and I'll think about the next 2.
And you think that looks bad?
I think it does look bad because, again, the American people, even if it's supporters of Kamala Harris, right? And again, and there are a lot of supporters. She's going to get tens of millions of votes in this country. I don't believe it'll be enough, but she has tens of millions of supporters. But even those supporters want to know what her positions are, because so many people in this country are going through tough times, just like they are in the United Kingdom. And it's one thing, okay, the world is going sideways at the moment, as you know, and the United Kingdom is more in the sort of the target range that we are at the moment. And so these are serious subjects. And at some point, voters on both sides want Vice President Harris to address them.
We're just going to wrap up a bit now, but Doug, I'm interested actually, just before I come back to Jim, you're a former official at the White House and the Pentagon under, very different types of men, very different types of presidents, Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush. Are you 100% comfortable with the idea of Donald Trump becoming president of the United States for a second time?
I am, only because, again, number one, his policies, if people go... Here's a 2-question test I give to everyone that says, oh, I hate President Trump or I hate former President Trump. And I always ask them, okay, why do you hate him? And they give you the usual answers about, he's a misogynist, he's a bully, he's mean, he's insults. Then I ask, okay, well, what policies of President Trump did you think failed the United States of America when he was president? And generally you get no answer, you get crickets. And so for me, it's not about his personality, it's all about his policies. And in my opinion, he was, as someone who worked for 2 presidents in the White House, former President Trump was a very successful president. And the United States was, in fact, much better off than it is now. And so that's a reality.
And Jim Kennedy, how comfortable are you with Kamala Harris as a potential president of America?
Well, I'm the rare breed called a pro-life Democrat, so I have some concerns about that. And in 1980, I voted for John Anderson, who is a third-party candidate. I kind of wish he was around today. I certainly supported Bill Clinton. If he were running as a 1992 candidate, he would be very strong this year. I think there's a lot of questions that need to be answered. A lot of the debate's going to happen in the form of paid commercials by both sides. I'd love to own a TV station in a swing state because they're going to make a lot of money from paid ads. And looking at the paid ads will tell you a lot about what's happening on the ground.